Hello, welcome to today's video. Now, back on September 4th, IDICBeer posted a video on how to win with Necrons, how do you deploy your Necron army, right? Now, I actually watched that with intense interest because I'm actually planning on getting a Necron army or starting a Necron army in the spring. But I also produce, for those of you who don't know, tactica videos and theories about military theory, right? Or videos about military theory. So I was really kind of pleased to listen to the way Nick laid out his approach. I mean, it's extremely well reasoned and well thought out, and it kind of addresses all the different things that you have to consider when you're actually doing deployment. So what amazed me, though, was it was so different from my style. Not that it basically was not a case of like who would have thought someone would do it differently than me. It wasn't a case of that. It was just I never really thought too much about the fact that there's a lot of things in deployment that, and there's really, it's not a case of one being better than another. It's just proof that there's more than one way to skin a cat. So this video is going to be a video, a kind of response video. It's not a rebuttal. Don't interpret this as a rebuttal. Okay. Really, what I want to do is kind of explore Nick's approach, especially as it relates to new Necron players, and kind of look at possibility how might it apply to other armies, and then kind of compare it to my approach, and just again compare what are the differences, what are the similarities, right? Neither one being better. It's just here's something for you guys to think about, right? So while I head down to the table, you guys grab your paints and brushes, get your models ready, and as I go through a description of Nick's approach and mine and the discussion, maybe you can get some painting done while you kind of listen to me review this, all right? So join me downstairs. I got a little kind of a mock table set up here, kind of mirroring, or sorry, bad word, didn't mean to use that one. It's set up kind of like the way Nick's was. All right, so we got the three objectives, just like in his video. And to kind of recap kind of his approach, he had his two HQ buffing characters right in the middle. He had two warrior squads, fire warriors, so we'll use them. He had wraiths, or he said scarabs, could be the same thing. Your fast units slightly out front to the side, and then you could include like your heavy support. Like he used annihilation barges. I've got hammerheads as an example. And then you could put other support units in there as well. He also talked about adding, distraction units to the game, to the scenario. But anyway, this is the mirror deployment that he's talking about. So, what I kind of wanted to do first was, let's talk about the traits that this approach has that are actually supported by established military theory and stuff. Because, that's really where some of the power comes from. So, for example, it's flexible. That's a big deal. Flexibility allows you to respond to the changing situation on the tabletop. Having firepower available on both sides will, basically allows you to respond in either direction. That's fair. But most of these guns have longer range than you really would need to. So you actually need to be in a mirrored formation for that. But stuff like having what I'll call the slower infantry in the middle puts it in a position where you can shift left or right and get to the other part of the table as quickly as they can, right? And your faster units, placed slightly forward on the outside, are in a position to move quickly, not just toward that side of the table, but to the other side of the table, because they can move so fast. So they can all of a sudden just kind of fling over there. So that flexibility is important. Now, these are mutually supporting units. Regardless of the way they're laid out, as far as what unit's what, the fact that they're close to each other, and not necessarily proximity, but the fact that the fire ranges overlap the areas to the outside. So, for example, these warriors can shoot out to this entire side. So any threats coming here can be engaged by the whole line. Same thing for this here. So they can mutually support each other. That's really important. Now, there's a concentration of force that kind of goes along with that. The fact that they're together is by itself the term concentration of mass. Taking your mass, we'll call it combat capability actually, and putting it all in one spot not necessarily on the table, but in a position where you can apply that entire combat capability to a spot on the table. Now, because it's centrally located, you have a nice broad area of the table covered, even by the relatively short range of the infantry units in the middle. But that concentration of force, or economy of force, concentration of mass, is very critical to the power of this. Any threat that approaches can be attacked and engaged by every single unit here. There's nothing that's out of range to something coming close. Now, finally, and one of the key things that even Nick pointed out in his video, was the fact that being centrally located like this in relation to the objectives on the table puts you in a position where with a single line of advance you're able to accomplish multiple objectives. That's extremely important, because if you are not able to have a single line of advance to accomplish all of those, you have to go at them individually or separately, which kind of thins your army out. So his approach is very, very powerful for that reason and for the concentration of force or mass reason, okay? So let's kind of translate this to some of the other armies. Now, of course, I don't know them all. I just know my few armies. Haven't been able to really play around with the concept much with the Dark Eldar, or now Drukhari. But I think I can see how the Eldar kind of fit in with this. The way their units are kind of mixed in. But let's look at orcs first. Pretend this is an orc army. They're similar as far as unit mix to Necrons in the fact that they've got vehicles that can carry good transports. They've got strong firepower. Now granted, they don't hit real well, which is actually one of the problems for the orcs in this formation. But they've got a lot more close combat, like the flayed ones that Necrons have. But that's where this formation actually comes into play real strongly. Because by putting this, you've got your, let's use the War Boss for example, which gives great buffs to the your army, your boys, and your Weird Boy, which gets bonuses from being nearby other boys. In the center, you've got your boys scattered around it, even if they're in transports, racing across the field. Again, one line advance, multiple objectives. You can drop down these units out of the transports and engage with your entire force. You've concentrated your mass, and you're applying that entire mass to the opponent in a single location. That's, again, where the power of this comes in. So I can see some validity of using this with the orcs. Now, the other aspect, now being, of course, Nick set it up in relation to objectives. I'm going to consider it also in relation to the center of the table, because if you do this with the center of the table, it minimizes the distance to the furthest of the opponent's units. So you're never going to be more than 36 inches away from the furthest unit. Okay, most of the time you're going to be right across the table, 24 inches away from something, and probably the bulk of his force. So again, this is a good approach. The Guard, it's not so much the case. They've got a lot of long-range firepower, and they've got transports that really are used to kind of buff your units as far as keeping them safe. The reanimation protocols with Necrons allows you to put warriors down. Now the 4-up armor save for fire warrior is pretty good. That again keeps you there. But the 5-up armor save for guardsmen, he can't really take this approach too well, even if you do have a blob of 20 conscripts. The fact is, they're really squishy. Okay, it's still possible. You can still do that, but really one of the biggest drawbacks is they don't have a lot of fast units. They've got Rough Riders. That's really the fast unit they've got. Now, yes, you can do Hellhounds or Devil Dogs, or you could do the Chimeras, but sending those out alone isn't really going to accomplish the same thing as like Scarabs or Wraiths would. So it's kind of harder to fill that role right there in that first part. The biggest problem, or difference, is the orders bubble. With Guard, they have a 12-inch radius, so you don't need to be so close to get the orders off to your different units. Matter of fact, you can be spread out a little further. Now, there are some units, though, such as the Master of Ordnance, that actually does need to be close, and this is where you really run into the problems. With a mirrored deployment, let's say you've got your two heavy things on the outside. for purposes of this, let's say they're two Lehman Russes. Okay, there's not a lot that is different between the Lehman Russ approach here and the fact that your opponent, or the Necrons have their annihilation barges. Pretty similar, okay. But when you've got the Master of Ordnance, and then you've got the fact that he can only buff 4 specific artillery units, you don't want to be splitting those artillery units up left and right. They're heavy, right? They've got the same roles. So a Lehman Russ does not have the same role as artillery, so you can't split them up that way. You have to split artillery and artillery. Otherwise, keep them in the back, again, centrally located, so that your Master of Ordnance, who has to be within 3 inches of those models to give them the buff, can do that to multiple models. Now, the danger there, though, is you've got everything nicely, neatly packed for your opponent, so they can just kind of come in and just start tearing it up. A lot of potential there for just getting penned in. So, I don't think guard necessarily works as well, but there are aspects you can still use. Give it a try. Let me see what you guys think. But Tau, this one I'm really, and it's not because I play Tau and I prefer my way. It's not why I'm going to differ with Nick on this one. I think it's the units that are available here. Tau does have access to deep strikers, right? So I can bring down crisis suits. Those can be my fast thing. Okay, so I don't actually have to put them there. It's not really mirror deployment then, really, in that sense. And I don't have to worry about these guys here going out to seizing objectives, because these can come in on whichever turn I want and bring them down. Well, granted, turn 1 through 3, and drop them on those objectives, or close to them, so they can threaten those objectives. So that's really, I've got that ability, so I wouldn't really need to do a mirrored kind of approach here. The fact that I've only real heavy tank type units I have are hammerheads is actually a limitation of the Tau Codex with respect to this approach. Now, it works well with the broadsides, because those you can split them up, 1 on each side, that's great, but you have to take 2 units, so that's 2 heavy support slots. And depending on what formation or detachment you're running, you may not have a lot of those. So, be wary of that. But with your tank units, you can put your 2 tanks out there, but one of the strongest things about the Tau army right now is the fact that Longstrike can buff other hammerheads near him. So being over here, and let's pretend this is Longstrike, Longstrike will be shooting his ballistic skill 2 and getting bonuses to do damage. He will not be able to give bonuses to this to hit. So this one's hitting on 3s, this one's hitting on 2s. This isn't as effective as it could be. But if I do this, I'm no longer mirrored, even though I'm getting this. And I don't have anything else to put here that's like that. Speed and firepower-wise, there really isn't anything. I could put broadsides there, but again, they are relatively immobile, whereas these are mobile, very mobile. These are harder to kill than the broadsides. And so I don't think they're necessarily a good mirroring combination. So this would not be in the spirit of IDICBeer's, mirroring. So that's one of the biggest reasons I think there's a little detriment there. The fact that the characters really do provide buffs, whether it's Kroot buffs or Ethereal buffs or Cadre Fireblade buffs, that all works really, really well. And because they've got the 4-up armor save, again, not talking Kroot, not talking Pathfinders, this really does provide a solid way to deploy at least your infantry part. Okay. Now, it's possible to treat your, when you're looking at the fast vehicle or fast units mirroring, you could do this. Okay, we'll take the drones out for a second, and we'll just put these here for now. Okay, slightly forward to the side. Okay, with a simple move, these guys can all board here and be off on their way. Fast units moving across. So, though I do not have the equivalent of Wraiths and Scarabs, I do have Devilfish to pick up large bodies of infantry and move them quickly to another part of the table. potentially taking these objectives. So there is some overlap there. I can see some similarities. But again, I'm really torn because with Longstrike needing to be near other hammerheads, I really can't mirror that well here. Otherwise, I lose a huge buff. And when I'm trying to shoot these guns, and I can reroll 1s because of marker lights, I don't want him rolling a 2 because Longstrike can't buff him because he's on the other side of the table, right? Okay, so that's where that stands with the Tau. But let's talk about my approach really quick. And let's keep these out here for a second. Now, the way I approach deployments is a little different. It's varied based on the situation and what the opponent brings. But there's some things that we have in common. I mean, I have in common with Nick, but also things that all my deployments have in common with each other. The one thing that both Nick and I have in common, though, is this concept of concentration of mass. I do it slightly differently, but at least we have that. But here's what I do. Okay, let's leave the objectives exactly where they are. It actually ties well into my illustration. I will deploy my army to one flank. Now, this is obviously not a full table width, but we'll call this, there's a good 3 feet distance between these. So, between these sides, or halves. So, this is really kind of what I'll be doing. And these won't necessarily be mirrored. As a matter of fact, they can't be mirrored. These have to be close. These will be close to their respective Fire Warrior squads so I can pick them up. These guys will be off the table, ready to come in. So there's my deployment. The key is this. I'm basically flanking on one side primarily and putting a small force on the other. This is, rarely is it even 20% of my points. Matter of fact, in a 1,500 point, if this was a 1,500 point list, and I'd have these 2 hammerheads here, that would basically amount to, 20%. And as this got bigger, this wouldn't get bigger that fast. So think 15 to 20% of point totals. The smaller the game, the higher that percentage. Now, what I'll try to do is I will try to deploy these forward units 31 inches away from the opponent's deployment zone, if possible. Obviously, on long table edges, I don't have a whole lot of room to do that. These will need to be way back here. But by doing that, if the opponent has a 24-inch weapon, he'll be able to advance 6 inches and still shoot 24, giving him a 30-inch threat range from the edge of his deployment zone. If I'm 31 inches away, he cannot shoot me with his infantry weapons on turn 1. Okay, so I'm insulating myself a bit from the lethal alpha strike. But on my first turn, he'll be in range. I'll be able to cut him down. Okay, even if it's my, if it's any of my infantry, because if he's moved forward 6, that means I don't have to move forward any more than 1 inch. And in the case of Fire Warriors, not at all. Now, placing the heavy vehicles the way I have off to the side, I'm trying to do that in response to where the opponent's going to put his heavy weapons. So if this is off to the left-hand corner of the table, las cannons and a lot of the heavy weapons are 48-inch range or so. Yes, there are some that are 70-some-inch range, but the really nasty ones aren't. The really nasty ones are usually 48 or less. And so here, if the opponent has their heavy, nasty, really bad stuff over here in the side, I'm out of range of his. He can't engage me first turn. He'll have to spend time moving to get in range. Similarly here, I can respond and take the squishy stuff. If his infantry is all over here and mine's over here, his infantry won't be able to engage mine as well. So I'm trying to offset compared to the opponent so that I am not vulnerable to the weapons designed to take out my stuff. That's what I'm trying to accomplish. Now, I also deploy faster units to the outside. So, so I would put, like, for example, a drone squadron kind of to the side here. Now, remember, there's about 3 foot here difference. This way, these can quickly move around. Ignore the fact that they're drones and I can use them as a blade of wounds. Ignore that. That's not why I do this. These are able to move quickly relative to the infantry, and I can shift them left, right to do what I need to do, even to bring them in as a screen if needed, for example. So I can bring a screen here to protect it from a charge. Obviously, they'll be spread out a little bit more. I could move them further out here to prevent a deep strike of some melta guns, for example, that could hammer or damage this. Stuff like that. There's a lot of things I can do because I'm fast. I can get in position quickly to respond to threats that are coming on this flank. Now, the other thing that I will do is I'll deploy flyers or special threats like this. These are my special threats, the hammerheads or flyers. Over here on the small side, a small, what I call a flanking force. So I'm basically flanking on both sides. But, whereas this is my main force with everything in it, this is 15 to 20% of my points. Usually the heavy hitters put some screen around them to protect them a little bit. Again, just cushioning. Because they can move 12 inches, I'm able to move around the battlefield and even close in if I have to. But this puts me in a position to engage down the entire length of the table with these particular guns. And that's key because I have, again, Imperial Guard have long-range guns. These have long-range guns. My Tyranid don't. So again, this doesn't work as well, but I can still do that as long as the opponent does not castle up in one of the other corners, because if they're in the center, my longest range Tyranid gun's 36 inches here. Well, actually, there are a couple, I think, are 48 too, but let's just say 36. From either side, I can engage him in the center or their flank. So I mean, this will still work with the Tyranid army. All right, so now this approach actually shares the same traits that Nyx does as far as military theory goes. So we really don't have anything from the theoretical perspective that's really that much different at this point, okay? So, how do you say which one's better? Well, you don't. You really, that's one of the points I want to try to make here is there's multiple ways to skin a cat. Here's mine. So let's talk about the differences, though, because there are differences, and they do have meaning. But like I said, just with all approaches, differences will be there. That means there are similarities and the differences in both strengths and weaknesses. They'll have different weaknesses, different strengths, similar different weaknesses. So it all kind of plays together. But let's see how these compare. Now I'm going to go back though. I used to teach my fencing students something. In fencing you have a nice set of what I used to call tools, different moves, whether it's footwork moves, hand moves, weapon moves, attack, defense, a huge collection of things you could do. No one of those is perfect, it's for everything. So I used to tell my students, the best fencers, in this case gamers, will be those that are able to maximize their strengths while both minimizing their weaknesses and exploiting their opponent's weaknesses given the current situation. So it's all about that current situation. You might be out of your element and that might make it harder for you. Throw a few curveballs that you end up not maximizing the things you need to. So the current situation does factor in. So with that in mind, let's talk about our differences here. In Nick's central deployment approach, again, central with respect to these objectives, he actually has both flanks open to threats from the side. So deep strikers can come down and assault from the side very easily. Coming in from the front, you can have the enemy can swing stuff around, coming angled shots. This is actually less of an issue with the larger their army gets, but with small ones, it's really very serious in my opinion. Now with mine though, I'm really only exposing one flank. Remember, there's about 3 foot between these two parts of my army. So yes, the opponent can come into this and try to flank me here, or try to flank me here. The problem is there's 3 foot. That means he's at least 18 inches away from one or the other, which means he's in weapon range of almost everything I've got. So whatever comes here gets hit from both sides. And if you remember World War II, Germany fought a war on 2 fronts and didn't do so well. So it's kind of the same concept here. Now, the thing is with Nick's centrally grouped deployment, it does make it easier to move your entire force, though, in one direction. Well, even if these are shifted, moving in one direction, you will be able to achieve more objectives because you've got your whole army together, centrally located with respect to the objectives. My approach not so much. See, it actually places, and I'm kind of glad I moved these for this example, it places my flanking army in a position where this one is much further away. I am much less likely to achieve this objective than I am these two with the single line of advance. I'm forced to use these units to do that. Now that's dangerous because these units might not be, and in fact they aren't, very good at holding objectives without additional support. And I don't want to keep adding units to this side. Otherwise I'm splitting my army. That's not what I'm trying to do. So, he's got an advantage there. And with what Liddell Hartz espouses, take a line of approach that leads to multiple objectives. His is better than mine. Okay. Now, remember though, I do have things like deep strikers that can come in. He does too, so he doesn't need to worry about it. I do. I need to factor in these other approaches to accomplish this objective. So it just forces that additional level of complexity and factors into my game plan. And that'll come up in a couple more seconds. All right, now, the mirrored deployment, especially when it's centrally deployed, let's go back to this. If it is centrally deployed, you are really ensuring that your army is as close to the enemy guns as possible. No matter where they put on their force, no matter where they put on the table, something of your army is going to be within range of probably both sides of it. So he had 2 annihilation barges right in the center of the table, essentially. A las cannon placed here would catch both of them, could catch both of them. So there's multiple targets he can shoot at. In this particular approach, I've got it situated so I'm actually trying to set my army up so that I'm at least part of my army is out of range of those weapons. And because of the weapons I have in my army specifically, I'm able to engage their entire line with the ranges I have. So again, here's a situation where the weapon capabilities and the capabilities of the army do have an influence of how effective the deployment style is. Now, with a smaller army, the mirror deployment is even more dangerous in that way because everything is so close together. Well, not necessarily, but let's assume so. It's mirrored and it's close enough to support each other. Ghost arcs need to be within a certain distance to buff the reanimation protocol of the warriors and so forth. So you're going to kind of compact your army a little bit. It basically makes it easier with a smaller army to stay within the entire weapon range of your opponent. Okay, again, with smaller armies, the mirror deployment will basically force you into one or two things. You're either going to group up in small, like Nick showed, or you're going to kind of be tempted to spread out to cover more ground. Okay. Now, if you're grouped up, you really can't introduce the dilemmas that are resulting from positional advantage, like the outflanking can. If you're spread out, you can't concentrate your fire, which remember is one of the key reasons his approach is so powerful. You don't have that concentration of mass. You don't have that economy of force. And so now you can't use your combat capability to maximum success or effect. On my side, I've got 2 areas where I've got concentration of mass. These can support each other, and this is a very strong position. This is a strong position with its small force. An army of the same size is, again, concentration of mass, economy of force. It's all right there, one small spot. And I'm starting to put pressure from the very beginning by having a threat from either side. The opponent may have to decide to send off part of his army here to engage, which means there's even less approaching here, so I can focus my fire here. Shooting at this side, he doesn't whittle me down as fast as I whittle him down, buying me time potentially for these to move away, or these guys to redirect fire there. Now, because of these being separate and me being able to concentrate the force, as long as I use them to concentrate on the threats that are engaging them individually, then I'm benefiting from that concentration. If I have a threat coming here and I use these to attack something over here, I've wasted that benefit, right? So there is that. Now, there's always exceptions. The one big thing is, for example, use the las cannon example. Las cannon in the middle, it's not going to matter which method you use, but a multi-melta in the middle will, because here in my flank deployment, again, remember there's 3-foot distance here. that multi-melt is going to take a turn or two to get within melter range of whatever is here in the center. With my flank deployment, it's going to take 3 or 4 turns to get within melter range. Plenty of time to start shooting it down, taking it out. So, the opponent's bringing certain weapon systems. You got to use those in consideration of how you're going to deploy. All right, now implications of 8th edition are huge right now. Now, in narrative, you can still deploy one player, then the other player deploys. So, very much like 7th edition. You can deploy, and then if you deploy everything nice, mirrored, compact, your opponent can respond in kind. Same thing if you do it mirrored, spread out, they can respond in kind. And in fact, I prefer my opponents to spread out because then this particular approach, if I go second, basically it takes the advantage of them by focusing this portion on a smaller portion of their line. And these are that distraction and that danger, that diversion, that threat from the other side, dilemma if you will, that causes them pain. Now, in 8th edition though, you alternate, okay? So that's interesting because now, what do you do? Because your opponent can now respond to you. So now, if he puts down the multi-melta in the center, and I put something down on the side, well, he'll make sure his next multi-melta is in front of it. If he puts his las cannon down at this end, and I put something here, he'll make sure something counts. So there's all this back and forth. So you've really got to be careful when you centrally deploy and just focus on just centrally deploying everything in a mirror fashion. Your opponent can easily pick up on what you're doing, especially if he sees a pattern, okay? And then he can respond a little more in kind. But still, there's ways around that, right? It is still possible to gain an advantage with the mirror deployment, and in fact, any deployment. So, but to preserve the ability to secure and maintain whatever advantage you'd want when you're deploying, you should consider the following. The first one is deploying your reserve units early or first, right? Because that forces the opponent to deploy stuff on the table first. Now, of course, this becomes a race between who has more deep striking units or units that deploy off the board. Because the one who has fewer of those starts placing units on the board first, and that gives the other player a chance to respond on the table. Okay. Now, because that's the case, you can actually play that to your advantage. Because let's just pretend we're going to do Nick's mirrored deployment. Okay. Okay, what I would be able to do to trick him is this. Let's just say this is a centralized deployment like Nick's doing. I don't have to start placing down, my Necron Lord and then my warriors and just start doing the building from the center out, right? I can have my first drop be this devilfish to the side. And then my second drop be this hammerhead to the side. Just try to trick them into thinking I'm going to put something over here and start building a force over here. Kind of slowly building this way, right? Or, in the mirrored approach, I could drop one end and then a unit here, a unit back here, a unit over here to the left. Just make it look like I'm actually going to spread stuff out. But as it starts to fall together, it's actually this nice mirrored compact group. Because I'm putting these other units down first, it may cause the opponent to make some assumptions and respond to my deployment with deployment moves of his own that could be a mistake in his part. So you can game it that way. Deploying units also that are not expected to move, like these broadsides, for example, if I know that I'm not going to move them, I can put those units down on the table first. Again, not tipping my hand about what type of deployment I'm pursuing. And that gives me a chance to respond to what the opponent does. So, that's kind of some thoughts for that. But now I want to talk a little bit about, have a little word or two about distraction units. I've heard this term thrown around a lot, and it is a descriptive term. However, I also think it tends to pigeonhole our thinking, about what units the units are actually for. Just like Nick had, he had a night side, he had tomb blades, or whatever. So we'll call these crisis suits part of the distraction unit, kind of like the death marks. Come in the back, do some damage and stuff. They're an annoyance, but you think about it. Flyers flying up and down the battlefield, and it's an obvious target. Because of the way we look at these as distraction units, I think we're devaluing them by using that term. Because I think we often, they go in and they distract the enemy, and they cause them to shoot at something other than our main force. But I think we tend to look at them more as throwaway. Who cares if the flyer dies? It's not central to my scheme anyway, right? So what if as long as the crisis just take out a couple units that, and make their points back, I'm okay. I think that might be shortchanging us a bit. There's more to these, and we should use them wisely. So think of, treat them as skirmishers in the old days. Skirmishers were individuals or small units, javelins, slings, arrows, small missiles that could, and very fast moving runners and such, that can quickly get in and out of the area. Has basically harassed the front lines, trying to demoralize the enemy, give them something to worry about while your lines are still forming. Then when the battle's about to engage, the skirmishers move off to the sides, escaping the main thrust of the battle, and then they start pelting everybody from the side. They're a threat that's still annoying. They're a distraction unit, but they're one that survives the whole battle, assuming you win. And then as a result, they're harassing and hurting the enemy. Granted, they might only be putting a 1 wound or 2 wounds down a turn, but they're doing wounds. It's an annoyance, just like mosquitoes and gnats and biting flies. They're not going to kill you, but man, you get tired of them. It makes you make mistakes, right? And that's what you're trying to do here. Now, Nick's correct in saying that every army should have these, because honestly, that is the best way to put pressure on your opponent from an unexpected direction, especially since now we have this alternating deployment, and the opponent can counter your deploy moves with relative ease. So this gives you another way to put pressure on them. If you're putting pressure on them, they're more likely to make a mistake. They make a mistake, you're more likely to win. Okay. So, in summary, if you will permit me, for Necrons, Orcs, and Tyranids, and honestly possibly the Craft World Eldar, because their Guardians are short-range firepower. It's not all that great. This mirror deployment approach actually is very sound and is a good, solid way to handle those armies. Now, however, though, the mirror deployment may make it hard for some armies, such as Guard and Tau, and maybe even Dark Eldar, to maximize some of their buffing characters, potentially. So I don't know about the Dark Eldar yet, because I haven't really played around with that concept, but at least for Guard and Tau, for sure. Now, centrally deploying on the table, mirrored, or otherwise, even if you're not mirrored, really, it puts your army within reach of the entire enemy army, because you're centrally located. Regardless of what side the opponent's on, or even if they're spread across the board, you're easy to get at, right? And it also makes it harder for you to use your positional advantage to cause your opponent to shift. So if I go back to this approach where I have 2 flanks. Again, let's pretend these are 2 hammerheads. And I've got my units out there. This is my force. I've got a threat here. I'm enticing my opponent to come off and deal with this. If he can't shoot it, he wants to assault it. Well, that means he's peeling off units of his force, which may open up an opening for these deep strikers, or take the pressure off of these guys. Okay, so that's an advantage of doing this flanking as opposed to setting up central like in Nick's mirror deployment. Now, the flank deployment really does force your opponent into that dilemma, kind of to meet the threats you're bringing. Now, granted, there are different threats on either side, but if it really helps dislocate them, like I mentioned, moving his units over to deal with one threat or the other, if he strings his deployment out along the entire table edge, you can concentrate your entire force against this small segment of his army and wipe it out with a lot more ease, because you have the volume of fire, or volume of combat capability here being pressed onto this small group of units relative to his army is not a match for what he can return. Okay, and over here, similarly, this may be more even, but this is your local superiority, and this is where you have a chance of really turning the game. Okay, now finally, mirrored deployment, honestly though, seems to be a whole lot more forgiving, because if I do something wrong with this style of deployment, I could really get hosed. I mean, if I lose these tanks too quickly, I'm stuck in a corner. I now lose that swift advantage. That's, you know, the speed. That's not there anymore because I'm bottled in, right? There's just, it's a valid approach, but it does have that weakness. So again, you know, what does that mean? Well, you make up your mind. Really, it boils down to understanding your army list's capabilities and your playstyle, and basically adapting your deployment to maximize your chances of success. Remember, you know, as if you watch my Academy videos, you may remember this one. You know, Sun Tzu wrote that only the enemy can give you victory. You can't assure it yourself. If you do everything right, that doesn't mean you're going to win. Because if the opponent does everything right, it's a draw. If your opponent makes more mistakes, that means he's letting you win. Okay, so really, it's up to you. So, by the way, Nick, thank you so much for, you know, teaching me about using these Necron units within the army, within, you know, this deployment, because it gives me something to think about, and really is going to help me as I start this adventure next year in Necrons. All right, thanks very much. See you guys in the next video. Please share, like, and subscribe. Comment either on this video here or over on Nick's, and let's just continue the conversation. All right, thanks a lot, guys. See you in the next video. Bye.